Chapter 13. Egil Skallagrimsson. Battle-raging berserker, world-renowned poet. Circa AD 910 to 990.
With bloody brand on striding, my bird of bane hath followed. My hurtling spear hath sounded in the swift Vikings' charge. Raged wrathfully our battle, ran fire o'er foemen's roof-trees. Sound sleepeth many a warrior, slain in the city gate. Egil's Saga.
Egil Skallagrimsson was an utterly unstoppable Viking warrior and skald, unmatched in physical strength, skill in combat, and eloquence of verse. He spent his life sailing the seas, plundering towns, slaying his enemies, and having the sorts of adventures that would make him one of the most famous anti-heroes in Viking history. He did battle with armies of mighty warriors, cut his enemies apart with an axe, and once killed a wolf with his bare hands and ate it raw. Oh, right, and he also wrote two of the most famous poems in the history of medieval Iceland, and is believed to be one of the best literary minds of the Viking Age. Wait, what? As his name would suggest, Egil was the son of a man named Skallagrim, who was a prominent landowner and nobleman in Norway. Things started getting hairy for Skallagrim when King Harald Fairhair was doing his conquer all of Norway thing, so he left and set up shop in Iceland, where Egil and his older brother Thorolf were born. Egil was strong, talkative, clever, and incredibly grouchy. His large body, broad shoulders, and thick neck were made all the more imposing by the fact that he had a large, weirdly shaped head that kind of looked like an eggplant with eyes. It's described as being one of the ugliest heads ever seen in Viking history, and his skull was allegedly so thick in some places that it once deflected an axe blow. That, coupled with his horrible temper, has led some modern doctors to believe he suffered from Paget's disease, an incredibly painful disorder in which the bones continually change shape. Egil did not have a sense of humor about this. Egil first started showing signs of his sunny personality at the tender age of 7, when he was out on the playground and some neighborhood bully beat him up. Rather than run home and cry about it, Egil handled the situation like a Viking. He picked up a nearby axe and dropped the bully with one swing, setting off a family feud that ended up killing half a dozen people. Survey says, don't mess with Egil Skallagrimsson. At the age of 14, Egil did what any respectable 10th century Icelandic man worth his bearskins would do. He joined up with a Viking raiding party. One of their first destinations was a nearby island where a dude named Bard, who was a good friend and servant of King Eric Bloodaxe of Norway, put them up. Egil, who had a little too much to drink — there is a reason the most popular beer in Iceland is named after him — believed Bard was trying to poison him, so he stabbed his host in the middle of the dinner hall, fled into the woods to avoid being arrested for murder, swam through a freezing cold harbor, climbed onto a boat, killed the Vikings on board, and rode out of there by himself. He spent the rest of his life evading the long arm of the law, with Eric Bloodaxe and his wife Gunhild constantly sending people to murder or arrest him. Here's a tip. It's not good to make an enemy of a Viking king named Bloodaxe. And we've already seen what Queen Gunhild Kingsmother was capable of. The next summer, Egil headed out with his brother Thorolf, and they sailed up and down the European coastline, sacking cities and plundering merchant vessels. At one point, while in the kingdom of Kurland, in present-day Lithuania, Egil and his men were ambushed by a large force and imprisoned in a dungeon. Egil's hands and feet were bound to a large pole, and his captors informed him that he and his men would all be tortured to death the following day. That night, while the Kurlanders were partying and drinking in a large dining hall, Egil managed to break free by wrenching the pole out of the ground and chewing through his bindings. He freed his comrades, broke through the door of his cell, and found the Kurlanders' armory. The Vikings looted the armory and the palace's treasury, and then stealthily made their way outside with armfuls of gold and silver. However, Egil didn't feel right about this. He told his companions to wait for him as he headed back inside the palace. Once inside, he barred all the exits from the dining hall, except one, and then set the place on fire. When his captors called out, "Who is responsible for this?" Egil responded, "Here now is that same Egil whom you bound hand and foot to the post in that room you shut so carefully. I will repay you your hospitality as you deserve." The Kurlanders, lucky enough to escape the fire, were cut down by Egil as they came through the door. Everyone else burned to death. Not long after this, Eric Bloodaxe's wife, Queen Gunhild, Mother of Kings, sent 2 of her brothers out to kill Egil and his brother, Thorolf. When Egil heard about this plot, he didn't do what any sensible person would and simply watch his back. He changed course, found Gunhild's brothers, ambushed their camp, killed every single person he found, burned their ships, and stole all their plunder. Well, now the Skallagrimsson brothers realized they were in deep trouble in Norway. So they sailed their crew over to England and offered their services to King Athelstan of the Britons. Athelstan, the grandson of Alfred the Great, was in the middle of wars with the Vikings, the Scots, and the Welsh, so he was obviously pretty psyched about having an army of some 300 Vikings at his disposal, and let them join up. A few months later, the Viking king Olaf of Scotland launched an attack on Athelstan's kingdom, and Egil once again tasted battle. While scouting ahead in search of the main enemy force, Egil and Thorolf got embroiled in combat with 2 Scottish earls, and despite being outnumbered, they were able to defeat the much larger enemy force on the battlefield. The next morning, the main forces of Olaf and Athelstan met in combat. When Thorolf was killed in battle by the Scots, Egil pulled his sword, flew into a blood rage, and charged forward like a berserker. He crashed into the nearest Scottish division, slaughtering an earl, his color guard, and anyone else who crossed him. The earl's unit fell into a full retreat, and Egil's men gave chase, cutting down the routed Scots forces. The Scottish lines subsequently broke, and King Olaf was killed in battle, along with 5 jarls and a few other minor kings. Though the battle was over, Egil and his men continued pursuing the broken Scottish forces for several days before finally returning to bury Thorolf. Egil would later mention Thorolf in his poem, The Loss of a Son, a heartbreaking lamentation composed after the death of 2 of Egil's sons, and a poem now believed to be one of the finest in Icelandic history. You can check it out online on the Guts and Glory website, gutsandgloryhistory.com. At the victory banquet, Egil was given 2 chests full of silver by the king, as well as a bunch of other sweet swag. He returned home to Norway for the winter to mourn his brother and break the news to his brother's wife, Asgard. During the winter, Egil and Asgard fell in love and were married, which sounds pretty weird today, but was kind of common for the time period. Now, Asgard was the daughter of a wealthy landowner in Norway. After the wedding, she and Egil moved back to Iceland to be with Egil's dad for a few years. During that time, Asgard's father died, and her brother-in-law snatched up all of what Egil believed was her rightful inheritance. So, she and Egil headed back to Norway to deal with it. Unfortunately, the brother-in-law was a dude named Bergenund, who was tight with Queen Gunhild, Egil's mortal enemy. So, of course, the queen and the royal court sided with Bergenund. Now, if you've been paying attention to this epic saga so far, Egil Skallagrimsson isn't the kind of guy who's going to sit back when he thinks he's been wronged. First, he sailed out to Bergenund's island and defeated him and 2 of his bodyguards in hand-to-hand combat. Then, he plundered Bergenund's household of all the inheritance he believed belonged to Asgard, and placed a curse on the entire ruling family of Norway before finally heading back home to Iceland. A few years later, Bergenund's brother, Atli the Short, made another claim on Asgard's inheritance, so Egil dueled with him as well. In the fight, Egil's shield and sword got broken, but he killed Atli by tackling him to the turf and biting his throat out. Over the years, Egil had many other crazy adventures, very few of which can be proven as historical fact. One claims that a feared berserker named Ljot the Pale came to Egil's best friend's nephew and challenged him to a duel he had absolutely no chance of winning. Egil went along to watch the duel, and when Ljot started hulking up and bit a piece off his wooden shield with his teeth, Egil started singing a song to taunt him. Ljot forgot about the nephew and challenged Egil instead. They dueled, and Egil cut the dude's leg off. Another tale has him heading through a dense, treacherous, rocky forest, where he and his men were ambushed by about 15 bandits. Egil ran up and hacked 8 of them single-handedly in about 15 seconds, and then he started hurling rocks at the other 7 guys, who ran off and returned with even more of their buddies. In the ensuing battle, Egil was jumped by 11 guys at once and defeated them all at the same time, like something out of a kung fu movie. King Eric and Queen Gunhild did eventually catch up with Egil, capturing the Viking warrior when he washed ashore after a shipwreck. Thrown into a dungeon and sentenced to be executed the following morning, Egil flexed another powerful muscle: his mind. He spent the entire night composing a poem called Head Ransom, praising Eric and requesting a pardon for his crimes. The poem was so moving that when Egil was done reciting it, Eric gave him a full pardon and let him go free. Gunhild still thought he should die horribly, but that's Gunhild for you. To understand how a guy got off death row with nothing more than a sweet poem and a winning smile, it's important to understand that to the Vikings, poetry, writing, runes, and story crafting were all considered gifts from Odin himself. These arts were thought to be highly magical, brought to the world from Valhalla itself, and people who were talented in them were favorites of Odin. So when Egil publicly recited a poem describing the king's numerous heroic deeds, Eric realized he was being immortalized, not only in verse, but with the gods themselves. The king did not forgive Egil for his crimes, but he did grudgingly release him. After his many years of adventuring, fighting, and singing, Egil returned to Iceland to raise his 4 children, share his wisdom with travelers, heal the sick, and settle occasional disputes. He accumulated massive amounts of wealth and property, owned a huge, successful farm in Iceland, and lived like royalty until he died of illness at the age of 80. Today, more than for his sword arm, Egil Skallagrimsson is remembered as one of the most eloquent poets of the Viking age. Once with 8 I battled. 11 faced I twice. Made for wolf a meal. Myself the bane of all. Shields shook by sword strokes. Smitten fast and furious. Angry fire forth flashing. Flew my ashen spear.
I liked the original better. Although an army of teachers consider it the greatest work of fiction ever written, Shakespeare's Hamlet was actually based on a Danish legend written down by historian Saxo Grammaticus in the 12th century, about 300 years before Shakespeare penned the remake. Trial by combat. The Holmgang was a Viking duel fought to avenge one's honour against a hated adversary. 2 warriors would get together, draw a big circle, and then duke it out inside the circle with swords and shields until someone either gave up or died. 1 foot stepping out of the circle counted as yielding, surrendering honourably, and 2 feet out counted as running away. Fleeing, declining a challenge to a duel, and peeing your pants in the middle of a fight were all considered acts of ultimate cowardice.
Know your Vikings. Name: Egil Skallagrimsson. Rank: Viking hero, berserker, and skald. Religion: pagan. Born: Iceland around 910. Died: natural causes, Iceland around 990. Areas of operation: Iceland, Norway, France, Germany, Denmark, England, Scotland. Noteworthy: wrote some of the greatest poetry of the Viking Age, and once killed a dude by biting him in the throat.